Good evening. Yesterday, we began the exploration of a new social contract by talking about the role for governments. This morning, we talked about the role for the private sector. And we're going to devote the evening to talking about the role for people, for citizens, for courageous citizens, for imaginative citizens, for principled citizens, and for tenacious citizens. We're going to focus on a country, on Egypt, one of the oldest countries in the world. I think it's had the same capital and pretty much the same borders since 3000 DC. It has historically been a center for learning, a center for trade. As you know, now it's got about 79 to 80 million citizens, 60% of whom are under the age of 30. It's in one heck of a neighborhood. And when its citizens took to Tahrir Square for 18 days last January, it ended in the resignation of President Mubarak. Joining us for a conversation about this and Egypt today, Egypt then and Egypt today, are two Dr. Ibrahims, husband and wife. Saad Ibrahim is a political sociologist. He's the founder of the Center for Development Studies. He was arrested 3 times in the Mubarak regime. He was in prison for about 3 years. He ultimately was exiled. He returned when Mubarak resigned. He got on the plane and went back to Cairo. His wife, Barbara, is a sociologist. Barbara Ibrahim is the founder of the Center for Philanthropy and Civil Engagement at the American University in Cairo. She worked at the Population Council before that and the Ford Foundation before that. During Tahrir Square, she wore a sandwich board with a likeness, a photograph of her husband, since he couldn't be there. And our third panelist is from the next generation. Hossam Bahgat. Hossam is founder and director of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, which employs research, advocacy, and litigation in defense of human rights. He played a prominent role in the 18-day revolution in Tahrir Square that led to President Mubarak's resignation. So I want to start with you and ask whether So when the president announced his resignation, did you figure the job was at least half done?
No, I mean, of course, we did wake up the next day, February 12th, 2011, thinking this was the first day in the rest of our lives, thinking that we woke up in the new Egypt and that everything is going to be different. But we were under no illusion that the job was done or even half done. We knew that it was going to be a lot of hard work. But where we were wrong is where we thought that afterwards we are going to be busy rebuilding democratic institutions that had been undermined for 30 years under Mubarak, trying to establish the truth about what happened under Mubarak and deal with the crimes of the past and get compensation for victims, and of course manage the transition in terms of the most immediate political transition. And then we discovered that we were effectively living in an arrested revolution, that the military council that was appointed by Mubarak and then unseated Mubarak and replaced him were very much of the Mubarak cloth. And so we realized that what we were busy with months after Mubarak had been unseated was not dealing with the past or working for the future. It was really being under siege in the present moment and being overwhelmed by a fresh wave of violations and abuse, shooting of protesters and harassment of activists and censorship of the media, I mean, very much, impunity for the same impunity for police and security personnel, the same impunity for sectarian violence that we were familiar with under Mubarak. And that's where the disappointment came from. The disappointment was that not that it's been really hard for the last 15 months, and we've been working very long days, and it's not either that we have not yet embraced the new Egypt. The disappointment comes from the fact that that the most difficult part of this transition is that it hasn't started. That we unseated Mubarak and felt this extraordinary power. I used to hear my U.S. Friends talk about the night when Obama was elected and the results were announced, and how they felt that, anything else is achievable, anything else is now within hand, and that this is so such a huge accomplishment that any other challenge is going to be surmountable. Now, I'm not American, I did not feel that, but I know that what we felt when we unseated a dictator after 30 years in power by 18 days of mostly peaceful protests that mesmerized the world, and that sense of achievement that we felt that we are the generation that made it, and that we lived the most important moment in history before our eyes. We wanted them. Thank you. We wanted to work hard afterwards. We did not want to rest after that, but we did not want to be, dealing with new killings, new arrests, and new unfair trials, and 12,000 civilians being tried summarily before military courts, and journalists being summoned for questioning, for criticizing the army. I mean, that's, to say the least, unfortunate to find ourselves busy and completely overwhelmed with this when there is so much energy that could go into rebuilding institutions and dealing with the legacy of the past.
So the military had a prominent role in political life in Egypt since 1952. I mean, since Nasser came in. What is the chances, number one, how have they consolidated power over time? And number two, are you hopeful that they will indeed cede power and cede all the economic privileges that have come with that power?
Well, it is an empirical question. We are not sure, but we are hopeful that they have seen the writing on the wall. We are hopeful that the young people who staged that glorious revolution will always be ready to challenge them and to force them out if they linger beyond the deadline that was set for them. That is at the end of the month of May. So I have confidence in our young people, in the Egyptian people, to be able to stand ready to put whatever it takes to pressure the military. However, there are, of course, complications because there is another challenge that's facing, especially the young, secular-minded people. And that is, there is the military on one hand, and there is the Islamists on the other hand. And it's a very tough choice. Whom are you going to fight first? Both of them are not necessarily your Westminster Democrats. They are far from it. And yet, they are part of the reality. And that is where the challenge has to be managed with utmost care and finesse to get them out of the way, to get the revolution back to the young people who staged it, and who unfortunately, and that is where I feel a bit, shall we say, angry at the young people, like Hossam's generation, that they left the square on February 12 before accomplishing all the 7 goals that they set out in the first 18 days. having lived the square gave the chance to both the Supreme Military Council, which we call SCAF, and to the Muslim Brothers to hijack their revolution. And now the challenge is to restore back that revolution to its rightful owners and makers, that young generation. That is a big challenge. And I hope that we can mobilize enough to restore that revolution to the young people, to the future, to the idealists like Hossam and younger generation.
You know, Hossam, we use the phrase youth movement as though it were something coherent with a sort of a clear structure, a very clear political agenda, the capacity to organize and run for election. But it was all a lot more spontaneous than that, was it not? And was there a choice but to turn to the military council at that moment? Were there others to step in?
The questions?
No, I mean, I mean, of course, there are different narratives now that are emerging about what took place during the 18 days and who really was there and who deserves the credit. Obviously, no one group or one leader decided to leave the square on February 12th because no one during the 18 days decided anything. It was really, it was this amazing, you know, collective, exactly, or you know, collective organic movement driven by the sheer psychological power of anger and hope at the same time. And so, you know, I remember on the last day that Mubarak had in power, there was a group that decided to split out of Tahrir Square and march to the presidential palace where Mubarak lived for the first time, you know, since we had started the protests. No one was deciding where to go, and no one said, no, we're staying here today, or, you know, let's all go to the presidential palace. But some people went there, and it turned out that actually when they arrived to the presidential council, the presidential palace, the military put their guns down, and some say turned them, you know, away. And that was the moment when Mubarak got the message and decided to get on the plane. And that's just one example of how spontaneous everything was happening. And of course, there were people trying to organize, trying to form coalitions. There were also the older generation that immediately self-appointed themselves to something called the Committee of the Wise in order
It's a great title.
and decided that it did not last very long. And of course, there...
It's the Committee of the Wise and Short-Lived.
Yes. They actually called themselves wise men because there wasn't a single woman there. And they, of course, their plan for the transition was that, you know, young people cannot be trusted with the future of this country. So they need the wisdom of the older generation to tell them, you know, what the way forward should be like. And, you know, you are too idealistic to know that, you know, governance is complicated. And so we recommend that Mubarak hand over power to his vice president, who was for 20 years his intelligence chief, Omar Suleiman, and of course torturer in chief. And that's why it was a very short-lived. So there were some moments like these when people were trying to intervene and you know, try to sort of chart a way forward out of the impasse. And I have to say that, you know, when we first went down on the streets, you know, our expectation was we're going to get killed. I mean, obviously, we're going, you know, unarmed to face Mubarak's, you know, sheer brutality. And then a couple of days later, when we were able to occupy the square and the different squares around the country, we felt that, you know, he's just got to leave. You know, he's the next to Ben Ali, and, you know, we kept looking at our watches and thinking, you know, he has to leave now. As days went by and he did not leave, we got into the mode of basically waiting and seriously not knowing what was going to happen. And it was very easy to look around the square and feel that no halfway political resolution is going to send these people home. And of course, as you correctly point out, this was an incredibly diverse group. And I'm one of those that feel that this was not a youth revolution. It was definitely not a Facebook revolution. And it was certainly also not a secular revolution. I mean, of course, the call for people to go out on the streets on the 25th of January was by non-religious activist groups. But you know, as early as the 28th of January, when we really confronted and defeated Mubarak's police, Muslim Brotherhood were there with us, and they were on the front rows, defying orders from their leadership not to go down. They still went down, and then they were with us on the square. Right now, of course, I mean, I am a human rights advocate, so I believe in full gender equality, religious equality, protection of privacy and civil liberties, etc. And that puts me at a position where I oppose and challenge the political Islamist movement a lot. But at the same time, I believe it could be, I don't think one can put Islamists on a par with the military in terms of their human rights record. They don't have blood on their hands, whereas Egypt's military have, massacred before our eyes many of our colleagues and many protesters since they unseated Mubarak from power. At the same time, there is a certain appeal in engaging in a culture war, in depicting what is happening in Egypt now into a fight about Egypt's identity, a fight between secularists and Islamists, fundamentalists and progressive-minded or secular-minded. I think that real challenge is to find a way where we can all learn how to live together, because we, for the first time, are engaging in a debate about the role of religion in politics without, the heavy-handed mediation of an oppressive authority. And we have been putting off this debate for 8 decades now. Finally, we are having this debate, and we have to come to terms with the fact that the Islamists are not going to disappear because we wish them to disappear, and we are not going anywhere because the Islamists are taking over government. But we need to, our challenge as a human rights community is to establish consensus around the core minimum of civil rights and human rights and fundamental freedoms that everyone should agree upon, regardless of which party has majority in parliament or has formed the government.
Saad, you have written a lot on the question of the role of Islam and governance and democracy. How should we be thinking about Islam? I mean, remember Islam and politics. I asked Tony Blair yesterday that same question, in part because I think a lot of Americans mistakenly equate this to the Iranian Revolution. They'll sort of say, oh gosh, it's going to be just like the Iranian Revolution. It strikes me as that's a very unlikely model for Egypt. But help us understand what the role of Islam can and will likely be in politics.
Well, Islam comes in many colors, many sizes, many versions. So Egyptian Islam is different from Saudi Islam, from Afghani Islam, from Pakistani Afghan. Egyptians pride themselves of having a moderate Islam. Islam has been always moderate in Egypt, never really too extreme. We have had few extremes here and there, but that was always the exception. So in that sense, we have personally, as a secularist, as a civil society advocate, I have no fear of Islamists. They were with me in prison. I have fought with them. I have fought them. But it is always a fight of equals. And even though they have now greater number of followers, yet I can reason with them. Mm-hmm. And my center, the Ibn Kaldun Center, is located exactly 100 meters from their headquarters, the Muslim Brothers headquarters, in a plateau called Muqattam Plateau in Cairo. And the relation so far has been correct and cordial. as I said, some of them were with me in prison. And at one time, we had a common enemy, Mubarak regime. At other times, we had a rivalry and competition. And I think the only thing we are now working for is to protect that pluralism, that they have a place, and they should have a place. After all, they're part and parcel of the Egyptian society, and they have a constituency, and they have been on the scene. I'm talking now not about Islam, but about Islamists, the Muslim Brothers, for example. They have been on the scene since 1928. Yeah. So they are part of modern Egypt. And they have had their ups and downs. Sometimes their following was in the millions, and sometimes it has contracted to a few 100,000, but they have been always there. Now, what I am hoping personally as a Democrat is for them to evolve into Muslim Democrats, a la Turkey, not a la Iran, but a la Turkey.
Turkey, that's what I was going to ask.
That is an important point that we would like, and they have been talking about that for a number of years. And in fact, some of their spokesmen have made movement toward that, in that direction. Mm-hmm. Not all of them, but some, or at least the ones who were with me in prison, could see that point. And in fact, they invited the Prime Minister of Turkey a few months ago, almost a year ago, Mr. Erdogan, in order to kind of exchange notes. It is true, they received him in the airport as a hero, triumphant hero. However, when he told them few things that they did not like, they were not in his farewell party in the airport. They left him to travel by himself. It shows that give and take, that dialectic, and it was not lost to the Egyptian public. They received the man as a hero, and then they left him to leave the country in a very lonely, as a very lonely man. And they began to, explain themselves. Well, he traveled unexpectedly. He had something that we could not organize a farewell party for him, but they were on the defensive. But the point is, there is now dynamics and discourse among all the parties, including the Islamists. And what we have discovered is that beside the Muslim Brothers, there are at least two other constituencies in Egypt that also claim an Islamic agenda. One of them is called the Salafis, and the other one are the Sufis. And in fact, the biggest of the three are the Sufis. They are in the millions. They probably are anywhere from 7 to 9 million followers, Sufis, followed by the Salafis, about 3 to 3.5 million. And then the Muslim Brothers, who are only 750,000 actually, but very tough, very well organized, well trained. So you had these three. So you don't have an Islamic or an Islamicist camp that is unified, but it is diversified. And that is healthy, because Islamists are learning how to be pluralist among themselves as well. Just like the liberals, the radicals, like other secular. And that is a healthy sign. And again, it helps us to push them into the direction of the so-called Muslim Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis, they were the two biggest vote getters for the parliament. What do you anticipate will be the climate for religious freedom? The Copts didn't get any seats. Do you expect this to be the future of Egypt, to be a future of religious freedom, or do you have worries in that regard? I know it's something you work on a lot, Hossam.
Jane, you know the definition of a pessimist is someone married to an optimist for a long time. And I like to think of myself as an optimist, but sometimes one has to temper one's spouse. And I am concerned. It is very easy among a population that has never practiced democracy or citizenship or had access to enough information to make informed political decisions to sort of use religion to sort of say, you know, vote for me, you're voting for God, you're voting for heaven, you're voting for the path. And that is what happened in our parliamentary election, and I'm quite sure is what will be happening, certainly happened in our referendum in March. So we're in for a period of time in which until, and Egyptians are very smart people who see through artifice rather quickly, but there will be a period of time in which this is a powerful electoral argument. The other problem is, and this touches on philanthropy, the area dear to many of our hearts, is that we don't yet have a developed sense of how to separate politics from social service and social good. So people are buying votes right and left, and no one is calling them on it. And so you can get, you know, a kilo of meat from the Muslim Brothers if you vote the right way the next week. And until we have a little bit more maturity about that, it's going to be very difficult to find out what is really in the hearts and minds of Egyptians and who they really want to lead them. On the issue of religious freedom, I think it's going to be a process that's going to take some time. If you have repressed movements that wanted to use religion as a basis for reform and modernization and moving forward, if you've repressed a movement for 80 years, as we did in Egypt, you have to expect that when they have their moment in the sun, they are going to overdo this newfound sense of power and freedom. And they are going to want to impose exactly the way that things were imposed upon them. So you already begin to see prosecutions for blasphemy and things happening, not just in Egypt, but also in Tunisia, which is actually on a much more hopeful path. And we have a judiciary in which there is penetration from these organizations. So I'm long-run optimistic. I think Egyptian sense of fairness, their survival over many millennia has been because they have had a live and let live mentality. There was an era certainly that was probably began to end in the 50s, but a time in which you could go to school and not know whether your classmates were Christian or Muslim because it simply wasn't an issue. But the regime played on these sentiments and pitted people against each other, and our state security played a particularly dirty game in that regard. So we're going to have to work through all of these things. I think what we need from our friends around the world is, to kind of fasten your seatbelts and not overreact to one court outcome or one incident or one highly publicized event, and understand that these are processes, as Hossam has said, and we're at the very beginning of it. Copts are an essential part of Egyptian life. And when there was a particularly ugly incident in Maspero that I'm sure many of you were following, in which a number of nonviolent Christian protesters were killed after the revolution, my staff, who work on civic engagement and philanthropy issues, dropped everything, went to the morgues, went to be with these families, Muslim and Christian, and we spent 2 days in my small center in the American University in Cairo talking about how we would respond, what we would do differently to make sure that this could not ever happen again. And that was just one small place. It was happening all over the country.
Killed by the military, just to clarify.
Right. I mean, plainclothes military people. So that gives me hope. If you look beyond Cairo and the politics of the headlines, in every single small town and village, there are youth groups and people's groups that are solving local problems. that feel the revolution is alive and well. And if we are able to shine a spotlight on them and their innovative ideas and reach out to them and build those bridges, then I think we have a counterweight to the kind of closed, backward-looking forces that Saad was describing.
And yet the law still is on the books that says that if a civil society organization comes together, it needs to be licensed and by the government. And if it is to receive outside funds, those funds need to go through the government. What are the chances? Do you expect that law to be overturned in the weeks and months to come?
It's going to be a fight, and I'd like to hear Hossam's view on this because he's been working very closely on it. I am hopeful that forces within the Muslim Brotherhood that were repressed for all of those decades will join forces with us in saying that you cannot criminalize people gathering to address their own issues voluntarily, and you cannot close out the rest of the world.
In fact, Saad was charged with receiving external money.
From the European Union
Yep.
to make a documentary encouraging women to vote. Yes, that earned him a 7-year prison sentence, repeatedly. But this new law is particularly draconian because external donors would not be able to have a relationship with an Egyptian NGO. Everything would be channeled through the government. So we're calling this the nationalization of the civil society sector. And I think that it's beginning to resonate across this political spectrum, that it's not just bad for secular groups, it's bad for everyone.
And the emergency law put in place after Saad was assassinated, that's still in place.
That's still in place, although the military further expanded it not just beyond what it was under Mubarak, but beyond what it was when the emergency law was issued under Nasser in the 1950s.
And you can arrest people without, tell us what the law...
It's stopping, searching, arresting, and detention without a judicial warrant, detention for being a threat to public security or for engaging in thuggery or for violating the freedom to work, i.e. organizing a labor strike. And of course, it still operates a system of special state security emergency courts that violate fair trial rights and do not allow for the right of appeal. Now, we're heading towards the elapse of the 2-year state of emergency that was last renewed by Mubarak in 2010 in May or June of this year, and it will be yet another fight to see whether whether the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces will want to extend it and how Parliament is going to approve or disapprove of that move or challenge it. But just, this and the NGO law and many other laws that discriminate on account of religion or that restrict civil liberties or that enshrine social injustice and economic injustice into our system of governance, that's all part of the Mubarak legacy that we have not been able to untangle, to understand, get the truth about, or to, of course, deconstruct and try to clean up. And that's where Egypt is sharply different from Tunisia, because in Tunisia, if you go there, you will hear all the revolutionaries complaining as well. But they all know that they are on the right track. And so immediately after they unseated their president, they set up something called the Council for the Fulfillment of the Goals of the Revolution, or the realization of the goals of the revolution. And that body self-mandated itself to passing an essential package of laws that were necessary for a transition to succeed. So they issued a political parties law, an associations NGO law, a media law, an elections law, just a small number of laws that were not necessarily responding to a pressing need today, but they decided that without cleaning up this mess that we inherited from the Ben Ali regime, the transition can never succeed. The opposite of that is what happened in Egypt. We had even more repressive laws issued by our military generals compared to the laws that we had under Mubarak. And the laws that were passed under Mubarak have not been liberalized, with the exception probably of the political parties law, in order to legalize all these political parties that were working underground, like the Muslim Brotherhood and others, which was essential, of course, for the transition to have any legitimacy. But the problem is, we have army generals that are not only Mubarak's generals that were appointed by him, but are willing to be even more ruthless than he was, because they saw what happened to Mubarak. And they are determined not to allow this to happen to themselves. And so they are not on a reform path, they're definitely not on a revolutionary path, and they have betrayed people's trust in them as, depoliticized custodians that will just, fill the vacuum of power until we have real elections. I just want to say one small thing about religious freedom. In the last elections, we had more Christians elected to parliament than we had under Mubarak by 600%. We had 6 Coptic Christian members of parliament that were elected by popular vote. That would have been unimaginable under Mubarak. It would really, under Mubarak, the number of Christians that were elected was 0, with the exception of one minister who is now, of course, in exile in London, having been sentenced for financial corruption because he was a minister. The elections were rigged in his favor, not because he was Christian. Any other Christian lawmaker was appointed by the president. So I'm saying, of course, 6 compared to 500 is embarrassing, but it's 600% more than under Mubarak, and it's people that actually went and cast their vote and sent Christian members to parliament, and Christians represent 10% of the population. The moment you allow some oxygen into the country, it leads to this debate that Dr. Saad is talking about across the board. It leads to a debate in society, and it leads also to some improvement and some mistakes, but also a discussion of why these mistakes were made. Now, having a democratic government is definitely not going to be the end of the story. What we keep saying in our discourse is that this revolution was about establishing a democratic regime, but also fighting for a democratic society. Yeah. And that would mean gender equality, religious equality, pluralism and diversity, in addition to the regular holding of elections.
So, Saad, I'm going to bring you back into the conversation because the presidential elections are happening next month. There used to be a saying that any young man in Egypt could grow up to be president if his last name were Mubarak. Now, they're the top contenders. I mean, when you got on your plane to come here, it looked like the top contenders were the Muslim Brotherhood's candidate and Mr. Suleiman, the intelligence chief under Mubarak. They're both now disqualified, along with 8 others. What do you expect to occur? Who's going to emerge? What does this mean for Amr Moussa, for example?
Well, unfortunately, that is what is likely to happen. That Amr Moussa now is leading in the polls, the public opinion.
This is the former head of the Arab League.
He is a former foreign minister of Egypt, 10 years under Mubarak, and then another 10 years as the Secretary General of the Arab League. So he's well versed in foreign affairs, both as an Egyptian, as an Arab Secretary General. And he is 76 years old. I have been arguing in my writing, in my weekly column, in a series called 40 for the under 40, advocating 40% of all elected offices to be for young people under the age of 40, meaning in their 30s and the 20s. Because I feel, even though I will not qualify, I'm 73 years old, but I feel truly that was the young people of Egypt, young people of Tunisia, young people of the region who are responsible for the so-called the Arab Spring. And I will feel safe for my children, my grandchildren, if young people are in charge. They will make mistakes, definitely, but I think that making mistake is a human right. A human right, well, in a human right conference here. They're entitled. They're entitled since they took the risk of staging that revolution. They should be in charge. And I keep reminding everybody that the French Revolution, and for the first 18 years, France was ruled by people under the age of 40. In Egypt itself, Nasser was 35 years old when he staged his revolution. So let us trust young people. I would feel safe with young people than with elderly like Amr Musa, but luckily, or unfortunately, that is what the polls are saying now, that he will be the most likely winner. Hopefully, he will choose a vice president who is younger, like in his 30s, one of the revolutionaries from Tahrir Square. And believe me, these people I have seen are very capable. They managed Tahrir Square. I was here in America when the revolution broke out, but I traveled the second week upon summoning by my wife, who addressed Tahrir Square. She would be too modest to say that, but she addressed the million people at Tahrir Square, and from that podium, she called me in New Jersey and commanded me to come back. So I came back, and she took me directly to the square, and it was, it was worth it. A moment that doesn't come often in one's lifetime. Yeah. And seeing young people there in the square, managing the square, better than Egypt was ever managed. People were taking care of the garbage, of the electricity, of first aid, medical. Food was abundant. I don't know where it came from. And everybody was sharing with everybody. It was like, shall we say, the Republic, Plato's Republic. Very ideal scene in that square, Tahrir Square. I was hoping that it would last, but like all utopias, it did not last. But it really gave me that sense that our young people who staged that revolution are capable of running the country, of running the region. So I hope they will have the opportunity and the good sense of our own voters to put them back in charge.
And I do want to point out that the garbage was picked up by the children that in the association that Leila Iskandar made possible. So thank you, Leila, for that.
Jane,
Barbara.
Yeah, I think the dilemma of leadership in Egypt is one that will, if it doesn't already, resonate in a lot of other places around the world. I've watched an evolution over the last 15 months in how young revolutionaries think about putting themselves forward as leaders. In the beginning, it was one of the principles of the revolution that it was lateral, networked, collective action. And immediately after the 18 days, when the military started, wanting to hold these councils and invite people, young people resisted putting forward representatives. And they didn't, they felt it had been such a poisoned leadership principle that had guided the country for so many years, that it was always one man, and he had to be of a certain age, and he had to have a certain military credential, that they went way too far the other way and lost an opportunity, I think, for their voices to be heard. They were not forming parties, and they were not contesting parliamentary elections for legitimate reasons. They were fighting the military on the streets, and they were protesting military trials. And the fact that not one single murder of protesters has yet been brought to justice, but 12,000 protesters have faced military trials and are now behind bars. So it was not illegitimate what they chose, but what I'm hearing in the last 6 or 7 months is very different. They're saying, how can we prepare ourselves to be an effective prime minister? Give us a crash course. Mm-hmm. And they're very sophisticated about it. They say, we know we could go to the Kennedy School at Harvard, and we could take 2 years, and we could come back prepared. But we want to do this in Egypt, and we want to do it contextualized with our issues and our problems. So coming to us at the university and saying, can you help us to prepare ourselves for leadership? So there's been an evolution, but I think we are entering into a period in history in which leadership has to change. It will be more lateral. It will be about hubs in networks, as I was discussing with a colleague of mine before dinner. And we all need to grapple with how we support Saad's younger generation to take their place and to do it effectively.
Mm-hmm. Let me talk about some of the issues that await the next political leadership, because some of the issues some of the features of Egyptian life that probably contributed to the revolution still fester. Right? Take the economic situation, where you had great economic growth. You had 5% growth under Mubarak, but it wasn't broad-based. Most people didn't feel it. High unemployment, very high unemployment, high interest rates, high food prices. And now you've got more freedom, somewhat, but even fewer jobs. What are the chances that the economic crisis could prolong the political crisis?
The slogan that was, in the invitation for people to go on the streets on January 25th, and that was echoed much during the 18 days, was bread, freedom, human dignity, which rhymes in Arabic. And it starts with bread.
It's a great chant.
Yes, it's Aish Hurriya Karama Insaniya. And I think that, this was a brilliant slogan in how it really captured the essence of human rights, and not making any distinction between political liberties, civil liberties, and the social justice aspect of it. It was very much about bread as it was about freedom. This revolution was very much about social justice, social injustice, and economic injustice as it was about, a revolt against dictatorship and the restriction of liberties. Now, of course, after we unseated Mubarak, we are still living under exactly the same economic policies that were engineered and executed by Mubarak.
Except growth is down, in fact.
Growth is down, and the government is refusing, and the SCAF are refusing to introduce any systemic changes to the economic problems that they inherited from Mubarak, and they are continuing the same unfair subsidies, energy subsidies for large industries and factories. They are not introducing, social protection measures. They are not introducing tax reforms, and they are turning to foreign borrowing mostly in order to just carry themselves through the transition phases. It's very short-sighted.
And public spending is way up, isn't it?
They're not increasing social spending, unfortunately. They are keeping a cap on it, but they are also introducing, which is, unreal, they are introducing a shrinking budget in the aftermath of a revolution where expectations are at, the highest level, in history, obviously. The flip side of that is that, without the economic hardship in particular is the most effective means of communicating to the people how little has changed since Mubarak left. And it is exactly, the continuing policies of social injustice and economic deprivation that will make it impossible for the current Mubarak regime that is still in place to continue, to remain in place. And so I am one of the people that feel that, of course, the fact that Amr Moussa is even running for president after the revolution is an insult to me and, of course, to my colleagues that died for Mubarak to go. He was someone who served Mubarak as foreign minister for 10 years, did not ever criticize Mubarak for anything, and then was appointed by Mubarak for 10 years as Secretary General of the Arab League and did absolutely nothing to challenge the Arab autocrats around the region. And, he was part of Mubarak's clique. The fact that he's going to be Mubarak light or an improvement on Mubarak, is really unfitting after, everything that we have been through over the past 15 months. But still, my hope is that even if he is to get elected, and a lot can change between now and election day since campaigning has not officially started yet, but even if he gets elected, it's precisely because he will be so hesitant to introduce any real change in the regime, especially on the social justice front and on the overhaul of the security apparatus, subjecting the military to democratic oversight, scrutinizing the military budget, and bringing military business under the rule of law, dealing with crimes of the past, and establishing the truth also about what happened in the past. It's precisely because he is the son of this system, the product of this system. He's not going to introduce much change to what he inherited, and that's why he's going to fail. And we believe that this is the regime that was established in 1952 after the fall of the monarchy that is, in its last year or two. We believe that eventually the sheer psychological power of anger and hope that we saw in Tahrir and around the country last year is going to soon, come back with where blame is cast where it really belongs. Because I believe that yes, people can vote on the basis of identity, can be, can fall victims to religious, polemics during elections. But they are also, as Barbara said, incredibly smart. And so, there was a recent poll by Al-Ahram Center, that a representative sample was asked, who they voted for in the last parliamentary elections. And of those that voted for the two majority parties that are now disappointed 3 months after the elections, the percentage is 80%. 80% of those that voted for the Freedom and Justice Party, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Salafis are now disappointed at the conduct of their own lawmakers. That information would have been impossible to get, of course, under Mubarak, but it also would have been impossible for people, for us to dispel the myth that, even if a voter casts a vote on the basis of religion, it doesn't mean a carte blanche. It doesn't mean that this representative in parliament will always have my support. These are people that voted for Islamists and that, in 3 months alone, have already started expressing dissatisfaction with the conduct of their MPs.
I guess my question is, wasn't that in a sense inevitable? That is to say that the expectation is so high after the experience of Tahrir Square that anyone that would have voted in would be a disappointment.
Yes, and that's what's fantastic about bringing in the Islamists to power, because, for once, they get to actually be held accountable for their positions. They have been the most prominent political actor throughout the region and in Egypt for decades, but it has been too comfortable in the seat of the victim and the martyr and the subject of persecution, and now suddenly they actually have to answer questions about what do you think Egypt should accept a loan from the IMF? And what do you think of the economic program that the government is submitting to the IMF in order to get the loan? How do we fix the health insurance system so that it covers the other 50% of the population that are not covered right now? How do you feel about 20% of public spending going into energy subsidies for large industries, and at the rate of 400% of the public spending on health? How do you fix this? And these are the right questions that should be asked. And the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood are not only failing at answering them, but failing even at appointing a constituent assembly to draft the new constitution, and the fact that this failure is happening on live TV, literally, because now, it's a miracle, really, that you walk on the streets of Cairo during the day, past tea shops and barber shops and vegetable stores, and people are watching live coverage of Parliament. Mm-hmm. Everyone is watching the live coverage of parliamentary sessions during the day, and they are seeing how the Muslim Brotherhood are not only not creative in terms of proposing solutions, but also obstructing real change and really enjoying power in an unhelpful way. And they then immediately cast the blame where it belongs. And I think the same would apply to Amr Moussa.
Who's going to be at the table for the drafting of the new constitution?
Well, This was a great success of the minority, the non-religious minority. They were able to delegitimize the Constituent Assembly that was monopolized by the brothers. And then they went to court. The court nullified the composition of the Constituent Assembly. And basically now the ball is back in the court of Parliament. But you know, it was a great example of minority parties joining each other, withdrawing together from the Constituent Assembly, but also reaching out to their constituencies and mobilizing protests and using the media strategically in a way that forced the majority to admit that they mishandled the process even before the court had nullified the Constituent Assembly. Right now, there is no other choice but for all the different political parties to come to the table and agree objective criteria for how to elect a body or appoint a body that is truly representative, that can work in a transparent manner, that could enjoy credibility and legitimacy in the eyes of the people, and therefore could then produce a constitution that could be called democratic. And we have drafted an initiative for such objective criteria and are now collecting signatures and endorsements for them. And I believe that now that this was a very hard lesson for the majority to learn, but I think they have learned it.
Barbara, I want to just ask you about recent events when it comes to civil society organizations. And of course, there was a lot of play in American press when there was the indictment of the leader of the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute. All their papers were confiscated. What we don't read about, and it wasn't just those two organizations. There were Egyptian organizations with Egyptian NGOs. What happened to the Egyptian NGOs? And if those papers reveal a relationship with Egyptian NGOs, are they harmed by it? It's hard for us to get beneath the headline about those two institutions.
I mean, again, this is a replay of the old scenarios under the Mubarak regime. You criminalize, you penalize a few civil society organizations because you know it will intimidate everyone else. And that is exactly what is happening. We're actually honored here tonight to have with us two Egyptians who were leaders in Freedom House, employees who were establishing the office and helping Egyptians learn how to practice campaigning and learn how to be Democrats, and they've paid a very high price for that. We don't know how this case will be resolved. It is still in the courts. It is a case that, technically, each of these organizations, and in fact most NGOs that operate now in Egypt, were in violation of the law because the old Mubarak law made it virtually impossible to register to do democracy promotion, made it virtually impossible to take foreign funding without going through a lot of hoops and probably being denied. So on the assurances from Egypt's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other governing bodies over the last 18 months, these organizations were operating to reach out and assist Egyptians to realize their democratic desires. So the case is in the courts. My expectation is that it will quietly go away. I hope it will. But in a way, the damage has already been done because civil society now feels threatened rather than empowered by this revolution. They know that the army can be an even more ruthless opponent to people's power than the Mubarak regime. And so organizations have, not taken foreign funding. At least 3 consortia of international donors that were planning to come to Egypt, learn about the post-revolutionary needs, and support our reform process have decided not to come because of what's going on until these legal issues are resolved. So it's done harm. There's no doubt about that. But I think it's also increasing resolve. And Hossam's organization is partnering now with dozens of others that are pushing back in the courts, pushing back with petitions, and exposing what has been happening. I wanted, if you don't mind, to talk about civil society's role a little bit with economic reform, because it's so essential, and it's a place where there really is a role, I think, for a lot of the people in this room and the social investing community all over the world. We have 9 or 10 proposals on the table that could make a huge and immediate difference in the lives of poor people in Egypt if our legislators would give these proposals a chance. One of them has been developed over the last 10 years. It will be familiar to many of you based on De Soto's ideas about titling informal property and informal businesses, and it relates very much to what we've been hearing from Laila about the plight of the informal sector. The numbers are there. We know that it would unleash potentially 4 billion Egyptian pounds over the next few years if we gave people title to their property and to their businesses. And that is not, taking money from one place and putting it somewhere else. That is creating value and stimulating the economy. Our fear is that coming out of these religious traditions in which charitable giving was the norm and the way in which a lot of political support was built, that subsidy will be the quick win for the legislators. They will simply increase handouts, and we all know the kind of negative effects that can have on the economy. Another piloted and tested idea that we need a lot of support on is the idea of conditioned cash transfers to poor families, which enable them not to worry about where meals will come from over a 2-year period, so that they can work on getting kids in school, having health care for their children, and enabling 1 or 2 adult members of their families to be ready for livelihoods. And these are ideas ready to go. We need investors, we need promoters, we need partners with us to make sure that these proposals see the light of day.
Mm-hmm. I have just one last question of you, Hossam. Is there a Syrian Hossam? And are you in touch with him or her?
This is it's a very difficult topic, and for a long while in Egypt, we were almost successful in blocking out Syria because of how bad things were in Egypt, and many of us feel very guilty about this. But of course, we were picking up the bodies of our colleagues from the streets as well. But to think that it's been 13 months now and that over 9,000 people have been killed. In Egypt, we lost around 1,000 people during the 18 days, and that's sort of 9 times the tragedy. There are incredibly brave people in Syria. We hear about 3 or 4 arrests every day. And the community of activists that are targeted in Syria are not just the professional human rights defenders, but people who get arrested because they give a soundbite on Al Jazeera, or they are using their mobile phones to film violence and send it to news agencies as proof that the truth is not being respected by the Assad regime. And so, the good news is, as our colleagues, we have a colleague in Bahrain who has this famous quote that, the Arab governments have succeeded in one thing, which is turning their entire populations into activists and journalists. So it is not just one person in Bahrain or in Syria or in Egypt. As much as the international media keeps looking for the one person behind the protests to try and profile, when we say that this movement that is really running across the region is leaderless, we really mean it. It is leaderless in a very positive sense. Of course, there is a flip side to it in terms of decision making and forward looking planning, but the positive side of it is that every single person is really an activist, a journalist, and of course a target, unfortunately.